I'm Don Isaac, the Executive Director of the Office of Research and Grants, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. William Whitney, Associate Professor in APU's Department of Psychology. He has a BA in Speech Communications from Ouachita Baptist University and a PhD in Systematic Theology from Fuller Seminary. But that's not all. In between, he has 3 master's degrees. A Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, a Master of Studies in Theology from the University of Oxford, and Master of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy from Fuller. Dr. Whitney is an active scholar. His first book on the doctrine of creation was in 2013, and that was right about the time he was coming to APU full-time. He followed that with a book chapter, several journal articles, 4 published book reviews, and many presentations, and maybe more than what I've mentioned here. But all of these were leading up to his recent book, which was co-authored with his colleague from Fuller, titled Theology for Psychology and Counseling, an Invitation to Holistic Christian Practice. His areas of expertise include the integration of psychology and theology, spiritual and religious development of emerging results, and how the doctrine of creation impacts interdisciplinary work between theology and other subjects. Dr. Whitney has recently focused on how Christians can best respond to mental health and stress with his work that has received external grant funding. He was a PI of a recently concluded grant with the Louisville Institute, and the title of his project was Developing a Christian Response to Mental Illness in North American Churches. And he's currently a fellow on a $220,000 Templeton Cross Training Award, and that's titled Understanding the Virtues of Purpose, Patience, and Hope in the Midst of Suffering and Significant Stress. So today, Dr. Whitney will go ahead and share his work on his recent book that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Dr. Whitney.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. And I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see that okay now? Perfect, thanks. And you know, I know this is supposed to be a semi-formal presentation, but I am interested in it being a discussion, or people have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me. I'm more than happy to stop and answer questions and you know, have kind of a dialogue. So we'll just jump into it. So this is the book that Cutter and I recently did, as Don mentioned, Theology for Psychology and Counseling. And what we were really doing in this book is we were really looking at how psychology students and undergraduate psychology students can get a bit of a theological background to reflect on psychology, basically. So here's some of the background of the book. Basically, the idea for this book started actually here when I started teaching at APU. I started teaching the integration class in theology and psychology. And I'm glad one of my colleagues, Carissa, is on the call here too, and on the meeting here too, because teaching this class actually sparked these 2 book ideas, one of which I'm presenting here with Cutter, or the book we did with Cutter. And the other idea actually I'm working on with Carissa. So there'll be another follow-up book, but all of these kind of sparked from this integration course here at APU. I talked with the editor for Baker, Bob Hozak, and way back in 2016. I guess that's not that long ago, but it seems like a long time when I reflect on it now. And just said, hey, Bob, I have this idea about this book, how we get key concepts of theology and how we talk about them for psychology students and show how they overlap with psychology. He really liked the idea. We followed up in 2017 and 2018. I just simply didn't have time to work further on it. And then something fortuitous happened that was, you know, really a God thing. My colleague at Fuller emailed me out of the blue in 2019 and said, "Hey, William, I was talking with Bob from Baker, and I have this idea about this book. And Bob said I should really talk to you about it." And so Cutter and I started chatting about the book, and we literally had almost the same idea about a book for psychology students that introduces theology, basically. And so we started mapping out the book, and it was written in fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021. And it actually just released. So you can go on the Baker website or on Amazon. And I think today is the first day that you can actually get it. So it's already out there, and that was very exciting. And the spring 2021 was when I had my sabbatical. So I had time to work on it during sabbatical. So the overview of the book really does provide key Christian doctrines that were significant for psychology and theology. It introduces students to the basics of theological reflection. So one of the things that I quickly realized is, while my training is in theology, psychology students don't have any background on really, like, how do we think theologically about topics? And that's totally fine. It's not really in the curriculum. And so I was really trying and searching to find a book that would help students do that. And so this book really introduces some of the basics of theology for psychology students. It demonstrates how Christian theology informs the work of research in research psychology and clinical psychology. And then it really argues that students should view their work in psychology as contextual theology. So when we talk about contextual theology, all we mean is theology done from a particular context within psychology. And that psychology is done, we argue, with the Christian virtues of love and justice. And so that's kind of the overview of the entire book. So these are the chapters. It's 7 chapters long. It's about 225 pages. We talk about how to do constructive theology. Creation is a topic and a dissertation topic of mine that I've had a research interest in. So of course that comes into the book here. We talk about God's Spirit, which is chapter 3, God's wider presence. Then we talk about Christology, incarnation, and Imago Dei. Again, all of these theological foundations are meant to give us a background to say there are certain things within these Christian doctrines that we believe are important for psychology. And the important part, I think, just to say, is that we're not covering these topics exhaustively. This isn't like a systematic theology. We literally are saying, okay, for the topic of Christology, it's important, but what are the threads that we pull from that overlap directly with how we reflect on psychology? And part 2 is more of our practical and applied aspect of the work. Research psychology is experimental psychology, clinical psychology is practical psychology, and then psychology as contextual theology. So I'll talk about each of those. And I debated on how to really go about this the best, but I think what I'm going to do is just go through each of the chapters, give you a quick overview, and then that'll give you a whole insight to the entire book. And then we can have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So chapter 1 begins with this idea of how do we actually do constructive theology. We define constructive theology as literally just theological reflection on the particular context that you are situated in. So I'll say that again. Constructive theology or contextual theology is theological reflection from the particular context that you are situated in. And because psychology is based on science and the scientific method, we draw a contrast and comparison between the scientific method. So we talk about some of the basics of the scientific method, like what does it mean to ask a question, to form a hypothesis, to have your experiment? And we basically say, these are the basics that you already know from the scientific method. However, theology, it's not just a free-for-all. There actually is a bit of a method as we look at theology and how theologians look at situations. So we use the analogy of a phoropter, which is that thing that you go to the ophthalmologist. If you said phoropter, most people would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if you show them the picture, most of us has sat behind one of these. And what we're saying is that theology's method is almost like different lenses that we look through in order to get a clearer vision about something, okay? And we don't stray too far from the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Now, these are things that we look at when we're talking about forming theology. And we talk about experience, the Bible, church tradition, and culture. Again, we're saying that these are lenses that theologians look through. In the book that Carissa and I are actually doing, we take this diagram and we kind of package it a little more tightly to talk about how integration actually works between psychology and theology. But in this chapter with Cutter, we're really just talking about how these different lenses give us shape to reflecting theologically on a topic. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we jump into talking about the doctrine of creation. And this is, again, an area of research for me that's interesting, and one that I think is really important for interdisciplinary work between really any subject, but especially psychology. So what we argue here is that the doctrine of creation actually is the framework for beginning interdisciplinary work between theology and psychology. So when we read a lot of the integration literature that's out there, one of the chief areas of overlap that they begin with is the imago Dei, or being made in the image of God. But we argue that we really have to start with the doctrine of creation because it gives us several important elements. Number one, a Trinitarian doctrine of creation gives us an idea of how God creates, sustains, redeems, and upholds the world. So creates, sustains, redeems, and upholds the world. That is actually necessary for the order of creation to be maintained. That's important because it's that natural order that we actually investigate through science or through a discipline like psychology. So God creates a world that has an order. This order can be investigated or discovered by Christians and non-Christians alike. Creation also ties into the doctrine of revelation. Revelation, we talk about general revelation as well as special revelation in theology. And again, in creation, general revelation is really where we want to hone in on, because general revelation gives us the idea that some aspect of God's wonder, order, and beauty is distilled in the created order, and that this order can be discovered by both non-Christians and Christians alike. And that's very important for our entire premise. Typically, a lot of Christians have a very clear sense of how God works within the bounds of the church, i.e. special revelation. But we don't have as a robust understanding of general revelation. And that's chapter 3, so I'll hold off and talk about that in a moment. The last one is providence. So basically, even though humans willingly or unwillingly work to go against God's goodness and God's work in the world, God's degree of providence means that he upholds this order. So like we said, Christians and non-Christians, scientists can discover the order to creation, and it is God's providence that actually means that we can discover something. It is actually God's gift of grace that we can know anything about the created world. God did not basically have to create a world that would unlock its secrets to one who just investigates or explores. But yet God has created a world where the one who investigates, the one who inquires, the one who is curious, we actually can learn something about the world. And that's actually, pretty amazing when we think of it, that God didn't necessarily have to make the world that way, but God did. So from the Trinitarian foundation, we then move to the idea of God's wider presence. And this also is a doctrine that's really important for psychology, we argue, because it is the basis for how we understand any work that's done outside the church, and any work that's done by people who are even non-Christian, that truths can still be discovered in the world because God's providence and God's spirit is working to be able to let those things be known. Not only that, but God's wider presence means that God's spirit can bring healing and restoration through the work of psychology. It doesn't mean that that happens, 10 out of 10 times, but it does mean that we need to broaden our idea and know that God's Spirit is at work and moving outside of the realm of the church. Now, in the book, I don't have the systematic kind of theology here on this slide presentation to kind of back up some of these points that we're drawing from, but go pick up the book. It's in there, and you can check it out. The other thing about pneumatology is that as we bear God's image, we also create culture. And psychology can be understood as part of this culture creation, okay? God, in addition to his providence of upholding and sustaining the created order, in addition to that, he gives us the ability to shape culture, okay? And psychology, the sciences, all of those things could be ways that we understand that we actually shape the culture, that we actually have a way to fashion and form some of the contours of how we understand aspects of the world. So God's Spirit is already present and active in what we make of the created world, and this includes realms of psychology, both research and clinical psychology, okay? So pneumatology, we covered doctrine of creation, pneumatology, and then next we will look at Christology, incarnation, and the Imago Dei. So this is one of the chapters that I spent a lot of time on. There's way too much here to cover in one chapter. I say that at the very beginning of the book, or this chapter. But the basic idea is that we talk about how general revelation is then important to conceptualize psychology, but we also want to say that special revelation through Christ also is important for how we understand our work in psychology. How might this be? Great question. I'm glad that you asked. First of all, we have to take the concept of the incarnation very seriously. And here I draw from Irenaeus, the 2nd century theologian, patristic theologian, who says that basically his argument way back, and this is now the 2nd century, it's pretty relevant even today. But basically his argument is that since Jesus became an actual embodied human, there is nothing in the material world that should be disregarded as evil or sinful, okay? That God affirms bodily and human existence because he actually became a human. So that means that it helps us to uphold the dignity and importance of not only human value and worth, but also bodily existence of humanity. So Jesus's human bodily states, his experience of the full range of emotional states, his encounters with suffering, demonstrate the value of the human experience in our various emotional and psychological states. So then when we talk about bodily experience, we're talking about our physical body, okay? That we can't disregard that as evil or sinful completely, right? But we also have to regard our emotional states, our psychological states as something that are also affirmed by Jesus becoming human, simply because Jesus also had the full range of human experience. He experienced the full range of human emotion. And then wholeness and healing can be aided by psychology, since we recognize that restoration is transmitted or mediated in a relational bodily form. So this is really where our doctrine of incarnation is important here, is that we draw parallels between Christ incarnating and being human and really becoming in the context of humanity, to work that we sometimes do in psychology of really trying to understand or be a part or come alongside with someone to bring a healing or wholeness. We see this a lot in clinical psychology, but this idea that a person being there with us, incarnating aspects of maybe empathy, incarnating aspects of listening, of being seen, actually just that alone is very healing for us as humans, okay? So not that there, not that there's always a direct relationship between incarnation and the work of psychology, of clinical psychologists, but what we are saying is that there are affirmations of human bodily existence that are mediated and transmitted through the work of us being with another person in a field like clinical psychology. And then psychotherapists, sorry about the typo there, can act as embodied and incarnated forms of love for their clients or patients, okay? Just as God's love was shown to us in an embodied way through Christ, right? God didn't just drop down love letters from heaven and we only have scripture, or we only have these like letters of something God saying, I love you. But God actually came in human bodily form to show us what love is like, right? And as humans, not only do we need that, but we argue in this book that we can be extensions of God's love, right, for clients or patients as we embody this kind of love and do this in an incarnational way. So let me just stop there real quick. Are there any questions or comments that I could just answer before we move on to the second part of the presentation, which is the applied aspects?
It sounds to me, William, like, I'm a major fan of Martin Buber, who talks about the sacred space that exists between person to person. And Buber actually says God inhabits that space. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about the space between, therapist and client, we are two incarnated beings, if you will, modeled after the incarnation of Christ in the Imago Dei. And so I take this maybe the same, or maybe even a step forward. We read in 1 Peter 2:8-9 that we are a royal priesthood. And so it's almost like we are vicars, in a room next to someone. And we're actually able in a way to be agents of forgiveness, agents of healing, agents of wholeness, that actually it's sacred. It's almost like we as therapists become, kind of a mirror of the incarnated Christ in the room. Mm-hmm. And so I love that chapter that you, chapter 4. It really, and it validates what I teach in the integration classes, to see that this is so important to you, and it's the top priority for me, your chapter 4. Very validating, and I appreciate your work on it.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm glad you mentioned Buber. Of course, a big fan, and this idea of like I, thou, and how there is a sacredness between that, and that's really what we're trying to get at. And of course, like if you read some of these theologians who write on this, like Barth or Buber, like they definitely have the strong connection between the sacred space that is created between folks. Interestingly enough, Carl Menninger said that the church has actually functioned as humanity's psychologist before psychology came onto the scene. So he actually said something very similar to you, that the church actually operated in this way of being in this almost like priestly function to help people in their help people like a psychologist would. So, yeah.
And what's interesting, William, is I often tell students who are psychology students who are interested in or willing to invest in theology, you are becoming what the church has always been, mm-hmm. but is no longer, because it's more focused on building and expansion more than it is pastoral care. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the millennia of pastoral care, then psychology students who are invested in, pastoral care readings like this actually can become what the ministers were supposed to be doing throughout the millennia. Mm-hmm. More, because a lot of ministers now are focused on church growth and building programs, and they're not really focused on sitting with people and being that incarnational presence that you describe in chapter 4. And so I kind of use that to really affirm the psychology student for what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we have those folks within integration that even talk about as, this work is soul care. And I think that that's really important to remember, when we talk about it. So we take kind of these theological ideas, that Dr. Lambert was talking about in chapter 4 and then previously too in these other chapters, and basically are asking the question, well then, how does this kind of theology help us then reflect a little bit more in practical ways to research psychology and clinical psychology? Chapter 5 is a chapter called Research Psychology as Experimental Theology. And we talk about basically psychology as this way to give form and contour to how we understand human thought and behavior. So basically, Christian theology kind of provides a high level view, let's just say, of what it means to be human, or like a 10,000 foot view of what it means to be human. Whereas psychology can help further inform our understandings of some of the particularities of human thought and behavior. And then we just talk about some basic ideas about the limits of psychology. Psychology can be good for studying these observable phenomena or phenomena that are in the natural world, but it does bracket out the supernatural. And so it has limits, like all science, and it can't answer all of the questions that we might have. And then finally, we address the idea that research within psychology is always open to further theological reflection and critique. And this really is where we're motivating students, or wanting to motivate students to say, we need you. There are all these new areas of psychology that we need to reflect on as Christians. It's important that we reflect on them. In fact, that's what really we do when we think about our faith, or when we practice theology. So we kind of close this chapter with a call to encourage students to do this kind of theological reflection. The final 2 chapters discuss some practical elements, mainly related to clinical psychology, but also related to research psychology. So here we draw on the notion that Christ came to redeem, all aspects of human existence. So not only did Jesus affirm aspects of human bodily existence, but he also came to redeem these too. And Luke 4:18, that's the one, Jesus starts his ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news, to release those who are captive, to heal those. And so this idea of Christ bringing wholeness and completeness is important. And we talk about really, again, how God's Spirit can work to bring healing to these emotional and relational realms of existence. So I talk about in this chapter some my own experience of how I even got into psychology, which was that I had gone to Fuller to study theology. I'd gotten a job in a church, a ministry job. I liked this church, I liked this job, but I was in charge of, a group of young adults. And I realized that my academic theology didn't give me the answers that I needed to address all of the places where these folks were in relation to anxiety, depression, maybe some aspects of addiction, and then just kind of career discernment, life goals. And really, this is where I started to see from my own life, and going to therapy, that sustained reflection on this internal world that we have is a way that God can also speak to us, okay? And in evangelical circles, this aspect of God speaking to us through self-reflection isn't always talked about a lot. Peter Scazzaro, in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, is probably one of the most famous works out there that people know about, that he really talks about this more. But we really haven't had that kind of theology that has infiltrated always into the church. So we talk really about, in this chapter, this idea of self-reflection not being selfish, but something that God can use, that God can work in, through, and under our emotional states to teach us about God, about others, about ourselves. And that just as God creates this hospitable space for us to live, okay, so God is a gracious host, that psychotherapy and Christians who work in psychotherapy should also see our work as creating a hospitable space for others, okay? And our Benedictine brothers and sisters in the Catholic order, hospitality is one of their chief virtues. So as many of you might know, many of the orders within the Catholic Church have something that they really focus on. For the Benedictines, it's the aspect of hospitality. And so Swinton says we need to see persons with mental illness as created and vivified by the Spirit of God, persons whose unique mental health experiences hold meaning. And we draw some aspects of John Swinton's work into this chapter here. All right, last chapter is psychology is contextual theology. And we talk about how theology is really bringing God's love into a concrete situation. Contextual theology begins with taking our unique context and reflecting theologically on these aspects. And then the vision of God's wholeness and restoration for humanity should inform the present. Here, we give 5 virtues that we say should inform our work as clinicians and research psychologists. And I just want to go over those briefly. The 5 virtues that we kind of land on are justice, love, hope, grace, and hospitality. And for justice, we say that justice can take 3 forms: advocating for justice, understanding injustices experienced by marginalized groups or individuals in research or clinical work, and then 3, working to eradicate injustices in organizations and the lives of individuals. We talk about how injustice can occur on a systemic level among groups, on a relational level between persons, or even on an intrapsychic level within ourselves, or they can incorporate all aspects of this. And we argue in this chapter that the Christian psychologist should really be working to work for justice in all of these aspects: systemic, relational, intrapsychic. God is a God of love. We know that from our background and our faith. Here we talk about love in relation to love being extended to clients, to the work that we do. We talk about reordering relationships through love. Okay, so a lot of the work of psychotherapy, even though we might not bring that up with clients or patients, that we can see our work as therapists being an act of love and helping others restore relationships in a loving way. We talk about hope. Hope here has the emphasis that it's moving beyond just sheer optimism or looking forward to something in the future. But we have to have hope as clinicians because we see some pretty hard things, okay? And that God's hope moves beyond the realms of this world to the next realm of the new life that we have, where we know that restoration and hope will be present, or restoration and wholeness will be present. Next, we talk about grace. And grace in this aspect, we can write whole books on this, but particularly we're interested in here about grace as being a concept of energy and renewal from God that draws us into God's life. It enables us to participate in the life of God. Here I draw on Vladimir Lossky, he's an Orthodox theologian, Eastern Orthodox theologian, that compares grace to the rays of the sun. So in Eastern Orthodox ideology, this idea of grace being an energy or bringing other things to life. And so here we draw on this theological thread from Eastern Orthodoxy and say that as clinicians or research psychologists, this grace that we extend to either people that we are trying to understand or a study that we're trying to do, or our patients or therapists, this done in a gracious way, informed by God's love, gives a chance for other things to blossom, to grow, and to be present. And finally, hospitality is one of the features that we talk about. This aspect is largely informed by some of the recent work that I was just doing with Dr. Lehman, who's on this call. and some of the grant work we did around hospitality and mental illness. So it was a really interesting qualitative study. Dr. Lehman just first author on that paper that just came out recently. And in hospitality, we discovered a lot of interesting things relating to being a host for other people. And here I draw on some of that work, and basically we talk about hospitality indicates that we can cross boundaries, we can cross different aspects of origins, economic conditions, political orientations, and really be welcoming of other people. And Daryl Guter says in his book, The Missional Church, without such communities of hospitality, the world we have will have no way of knowing that all of God's creation is meant to live in peace. So I want to move on just to some closing remarks here. And I know that, I've been talking for a lot of this time, and I really am interested to having some discussion and questions. So I just wanted to reiterate, the goal really is, this is for undergraduate or graduate students who are in psychology, helping them understand how theology can inform their work, thinking, and practice in psychology. We're hoping to provide theological resources and also resources like the virtues we just talked about to help students engage in theological reflection, particularly in the context where they serve. And then on kind of a more personal note, writing and research are always things, if we let them, that can shape us and that can change us. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to get to reflect further on these topics. And also wanted to thank the Provost Office and APU for just allowing me the time to do this work and to finish this up on the sabbatical. So those were all really high points of the project for me. So we have some times for questions and discussion, and I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen so I can see folks. And yeah, happy to answer any questions or have any discussion about any of those topics that stood out, or any questions about the process or anything like that.
Yeah, William, hey there. We've had some great conversations. A few years ago, I started teaching abnormal psychology, and I came in, we had some conversations about sin and how does sin intersect with like mental illness. And I'm not sure, was that like the doctrine of sin, was that a component of this work? And if so, like, how did it fit in? And if not, like, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lehman. Great question. Yeah, I mean, we did touch on it in the Christology chapter, because if we're talking about God bringing wholeness or restoration, we also have to acknowledge that there are things that humanity does and things that are present in the natural world that actually disrupt that order, right? So in that way, we acknowledge that sin is present, and we acknowledge also that, we're also sinful beings, in the sense that, like, not everything that we do, even with our best efforts, always works towards this restoration or wholeness. But we have to be cautious and careful, ethically, and in community, to be able to be mindful of those things. So that's kind of the way that we address it. But I'm not sure that we address it as in depth, maybe, as even some of the ways that we talked about it relating to mental illness and sin. Yeah. Great question.
So each of your, well, most, or if not all your chapters, when you talked about theology, you had some kind of adjective in front of the theology. And in chapter 5, it was research psychology and experimental theology. And when you were talking about that chapter, you talked a little bit about the research psychology, but not the experimental theology. At least I didn't pick that up. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
What do you mean by experimental theology in that?
Well, great question, Don. So first, I have to give credit to Cutter. Cutter was the one who coined that term. And so I want to credit him for that. But one of the ways that experimental theology, I think we talked about that, is that we all theological reflection in some way takes something new and maybe we experiment with it or we reflect on it in a way that hasn't been done before. And one of the examples that's used in the book is that while Augustine or Aquinas, have great things to say about theological doctrines, the self, the human nature, the human person, there's no reflection on like social media, or there's no reflection on, let's say, the climate crisis. But it takes us embodying some of those Christian concepts and reflecting on them in a new way to make it relevant to today and today's society. So with the experimental theology piece, it's more that we're taking these concepts in psychology, and they might have overlap with theology or not, but either way, it's important that we reflect on them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
William, we're still, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can
Cool.
hear you and see you, Dr. Shelton.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I really appreciated the chapter on the Holy Spirit. I feel like that's as a growing up in the evangelical church of Latin America, I feel like most evangelicals have some Pentecostal in them. and the work of the Holy Spirit as a part of general revelation is kind of a new way to think about that for me. I think of creation, like God's creation, the mountains, nature, even relationships among people is general revelation that we can reflect on God's work through that. But I hadn't thought of the Spirit as attributing that to the Spirit.
Mhm.
I was kind of curious because it also kind of seems to bleed into the chapter 4, the Christology, that there's general revelation as well in that chapter. Is that right, or did I kind of mishear you?
So the chapter, well, first of all, your idea of the Spirit being an integral part of this, yeah, I think is right on. And I mean, I would imagine, like my mentor at Fuller is actually Pentecostal, and so I think I've been influenced by some Pentecostal theology for sure in this way. But that's kind of the critique of Pentecostal theologians, is that the Spirit has kind of been the silent member or the forgotten member of the Trinity up until the last 50 years in theology, or 60 years really, So I think that there is a kind of righting of the ship, that we kind of focus more on the Spirit. And, in Job, it says that if God were to withdraw his Spirit, like all of humanity would perish. So there is this moving beyond of just the Spirit and the work of salvation to God's Spirit and God's presence actually almost like being this interlocking web that holds things together, that holds humanity and sustains life. And then to your second question, we didn't talk about general revelation as much in the Christology chapter, but it's still present in the sense that while what we basically say is that while the work of psychology does not bring salvation, obviously, it can work in a common grace kind of way or providential kind of way to bring restoration and healing, right? And I believe as a Christian that God is at work in this process. So I work with people who are Christian and non-Christian, but both find healing many times, and I won't say all the time, through actually self-reflection, through actually being there with another person. And I think that we have to acknowledge that God is at work in that process.
Yeah.
As our neo-Calvinist friends say, God shines in all that's fair. So, yeah. Other questions or?
Well, we still have time for a few more questions, and while people are still thinking, if you don't mind, I'd like to pose another one. Is early on in your talk, you mentioned that something to the effect that you're thinking mimicked or paralleled the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And you showed that one slide. But what was missing was reason.
Mhm.
Was that intentional, or is that, talk about that a little bit?
Right, right. Yeah, good catch, Don. It is and is not intentional. That list wasn't meant to, first of all, be exhaustive. And we were really coming at it from a student's perspective, in the sense that, when students are approaching this, the reason part or the scientific part that they already kind of get from being psychology students. And, if I remember my Wesleyan history, okay, when Wesley talked about reason, he was more talking about it as a reaction to people not using their brains, almost like not using their minds, and almost like this more, he was wanting to guard against people just not engaging or not thinking. And so we approached it kind of as like, well, students already have that piece.
We
so
already
we're
got
gonna-
that, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a good catch. We weren't trying to follow it too closely. So
Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
So, William, one of the things that in most of the integration literature, or when I've read it, there's some core, like basic assumptions of faith that that it's like the target audience are Christians who are going into mental, psychology grad programs. And at APU, we have some students who are Christian and some students who are not. And I think that's been some of the struggle, is like, well, how do I integrate without this like core assumptions about, or kind of core? And so it seems like your book really lays out the core foundations of Christian theology. And I'm just curious if that was part of your like thinking or process of writing about it.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a central one, but it certainly was in the mix, Andrew. And I think that our heart behind the book is that students, like people who are maybe not, wouldn't profess to be any
Right.
religion or part of the Christian faith, would have an idea of how Christians might reflect on psychology. But then also, hopefully, with the last chapter, understanding how Christian values can really help us think about certain things was something that I think that both Christians and non-Christians can benefit from. Like what are some of the unique features of a Christian value of love or hope or justice when we reflect on psychology? And I think that a lot of us can learn from just reflecting on those virtues from a Christian point of view as they pertain to psychology. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah. So I like it how you kind of lay out the basic principles of Christian faith, creation and Trinity, the Spirit, Christ, and then you're ending it with, this is what it can look like practically in counseling and psychology. So yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. Yeah.
One thing,
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I found valuable was the book seems useful to people from, a plethora of different denominational perspectives, because a lot of the so-called integration literature I find out there, or a lot of it, it seems to be kind of like written around, for example, ideas related to Reformed theology, and it doesn't address Orthodox theologies. It doesn't really endorse Pentecostalism, or it does not endorse Catholicism. Instead, it's almost like trying to mechanically put together this concept of integration, like bolt by bolt, piece by piece, kind of based on Reformed theology. And it's very limiting. And this kind of ties into Andrew's statement that the explorer, the student who's on a quest, it seems to be very, very palatable for the explorer, the quest student who's trying to really get a basic understanding of this. Whereas again, in some of the integration literature I read out there, it sounds more like a nuts and bolts project to make psychology fit with theology and theology fit with psychology, almost like putting together a car engine or something, where you make sure all the bolts and the carburetor, I don't even guess they use carburetor. I don't know what they use, but anyway, it seems pleasant and gentle rather than, forced and mechanical.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, Stephen. I think that one of the challenges that we have in this book, and then Dr. Dewey Wardani, who's here on the call, we've been talking about, as we're also working on another book on that, how do we really help students move past that mechanistic aspect of it and move towards this kind of embodied element of practicing it, and I think that that's something that I feel like we notice in our courses, is that, well, you can have students read all these theories, but how do they really, does that really help them do it for themselves? So does that really help them reflect theologically for themselves? And sometimes yes, but I think that my experience has generally been, it doesn't always.
No.
And students need a little more in order to be able to practice it for themselves. So yeah.
Well, I always tell students, human beings are more than Homo sapiens standing upright with a brain on top of a spinal cord. Our brain is important, but our brain is connected to our emotions, our spirituality, our soul care. And so when we just simply focus on learning some theories and trying to put together some bolts and pieces to make psychology and Christianity acceptable integratively, it really just leaves the student feeling flat and not inspired.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
William, sort of on that note, I was curious, is there anything that you feel like from reading this book that you expect people to do differently in the counseling room with people? Is there any ways that you can envision, because I think a fair amount of this is reflecting on your own theology and sort of understanding some key ideas, but does it transform the work?
Well, I think, yeah, great question. I mean, our hope is that this is a conversation starter in that direction, but it by no means is that it's not the magnum opus of that question you ask by any means. I mean, my hope with the book and these final chapters is just students begin to think a little bit more and have some idea that the work they do, both within research psychology or clinical psychology, has ramifications for their faith beyond just the mere rote aspect of practicing, doing therapy or doing research. That these things, I mean, we hope this for all of our students in any discipline that we're in, that we hope these things are imbued with more of an idea of what does it mean for God to be at work in this process, and so that would be my hope, that we provide at least some beginning reflection on that. So, yeah, great question.
Okay, well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so and that book is coming out this week, you said. Did you say today?
I think it might already be out, or it's coming out later this week. Baker just told me February 2022, and
okay.
So it should be out very soon.
Yeah, when I was checking, I think it was yesterday. It was I saw a date of this week, like the 3rd or 4th. So
Okay.
they're great. Okay, yeah. So it's a book might want to surely want to get, actually. So okay, well, thanks very much, William Whitney, and thanks everyone for coming and participating with this. As a token of our appreciation, William, we've made arrangements to put a $100 gift into one of your upcoming pay periods.
Oh, thank you.
So if you would have presented in the fall, it would have been worth more, but it's okay. And just to remind everybody that occasionally we put our YouTube channel in the Provost newsletter, and also Yvonne has put it in the chat, and you might want to just click on that and maybe bookmark it or something like that. William's talk, of course, is not up there yet, but it'll be up there soon in the next few days. And you can see his and others as well. So thanks so much for your good work, William, and looking forward to seeing how your book impacts your field.
Thank you so much, Don, and thanks everybody for being here.
Okay, good deal. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.